Twin brothers compete for the same position in the family business. Old security footage reveals who is the firstborn. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the cutthroat world of corporate America, two identical twins, separated in childhood, find themselves unwittingly pitted against each other for the coveted CEO position of their family's tech empire. As the competition intensifies, a 30-year-old security video surfaces, threatening to unravel not just the question of primogeniture, but the very foundations of their family's legacy. In a high-stakes game where blood and business collide, Jake and Michael Sullivan must confront long-buried secrets, ethical dilemmas, and the true meaning of family. The sleek, glass-fronted headquarters of Sullivan Tech loomed before Jake as he stepped out of his taxi, the early morning sun glinting off its windows. At 35, Jake Sullivan was the picture of corporate success, tailored suit, confident stride, and a determination that radiated from his steel-blue eyes. As he pushed through the revolving doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that today would change everything. The lobby buzzed with the usual morning activity, but there was an undercurrent of excitement. Today was the day the board would announce the final two candidates for the CEO position. Jake had worked tirelessly for this moment, climbing the ranks of Sullivan Tech's New York office for the past decade. He nodded at familiar faces as he made his way to the elevator, his mind already racing with potential strategies for the final phase of the selection process. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan," chirped the receptionist as he passed. "Good luck today." Jake flashed a smile, masking the butterflies in his stomach. "Thanks, Diane." Fingers crossed. As the elevator ascended to the executive floor, Jake's thoughts drifted to his childhood. Growing up with his mother in a modest apartment in Queens, he had always known he was adopted, but the details were hazy. His mother spoke little of his biological parents or the circumstances of his adoption, and Jake had learned early on not to push the subject. The pain in her eyes whenever he asked was enough to silence his curiosity. The elevator dinged, snapping Jake back to the present. He straightened his tie and stepped out onto the 50th floor, where the board meeting would take place. As he approached the conference room, he noticed a cluster of executives huddled near the door, whispering excitedly. "Did you see him?" one of them asked. "It's uncanny. I heard he's been running the West Coast division for years," another chimed in. "How did we not know?" Jake frowned, puzzled by the conversation. Before he could inquire, the group dispersed, offering him tight smiles and nods as they passed. Shaking off the strange encounter, Jake entered the conference room, his game face firmly in place. The room fell silent as he walked in. Board members and executives alike turned to stare, some with looks of confusion, others with barely concealed amusement. At the head of the table sat Gerald Sullivan, the aging founder of Sullivan Tech and Jake's biological father, though their relationship had always been more professional than paternal. "Ah, Jake," Gerald said, his voice carrying a hint of, "Was that nervousness? Please have a seat. We're just waiting for one more person before we begin." Jake took his seat, hyper-aware of the eyes still on him. The tension in the room was palpable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. He was about to ask what was going on when the door opened once more. The room collectively held its breath as another man walked in. Jake turned, curious about the new arrival, and felt the world tilt on its axis. It was like looking in a mirror. The man who stood in the doorway was his exact double. Same height, same build, same steel-blue eyes widening in shock as they locked gazes. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jake's mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. Then, breaking the spell, Gerald cleared his throat and stood. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice strained, "I believe some introductions are in order. Jake Sullivan, meet Michael Sullivan, your twin brother." The conference room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and gasps. Jake remained frozen in his seat, his eyes locked on the man, his brother, who stood equally stunned by the door. Michael, for his part, looked as if he'd seen a ghost, his complexion paling beneath his California tan. Gerald raised his hands, calling for silence. "I know this comes as a shock to both of you," he said, his voice heavy with what sounded like years of guilt. "And I owe you both an explanation. But first, let's remember why we're here today." Jake finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "An explanation? You think that's enough?" He turned to Gerald, anger beginning to bubble up through the shock. "You've known about him, all this time?" Michael, still standing by the door, seemed to shake himself out of his stupor. "I don't understand," he said, his voice so similar to Jake's it was eerie. "Dad, what's going on? Who is this guy?" "Dad?" Jake echoed, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He'd never called Gerald that. Their relationship always kept at arm's length. The realization that this stranger, this mirror image of himself, had grown up with the father he'd never known hit Jake like a physical blow. Gerald sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "Please, both of you, sit down. The board and I have a proposition that concerns you both, and then I promise I'll explain everything." Reluctantly, Michael took the only remaining seat directly across from Jake. The brothers stared at each other, a mix of curiosity, confusion, and budding resentment passing between them. Gerald continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone Jake recognized from company-wide addresses. "As you both know, I'm stepping down as CEO of Sullivan Tech. What you didn't know is that you've both been in consideration for the position." Jake's head snapped up, tearing his gaze away from his newfound twin. "Both of us? But I've never even heard of him before today. And I had no idea the New York division even existed," Michael added, frowning. A board member, Janet Chun, leaned forward. "That was by design, gentlemen. We've been evaluating your performances separately in your respective divisions for the past 5 years." 5 years? Jake and Michael exclaimed in unison, then glared at each other, unsettled by the synchronicity. Gerald nodded. "It was the only way to ensure a fair assessment. You've both shown exceptional leadership skills, innovative thinking, and dedication to the company. In fact, your performances have been so evenly matched that we've been unable to make a final decision." Jake's mind raced. All those late nights, the sacrificed weekends, the relationships he'd let fall by the wayside, all to prove himself worthy of leading Sullivan Tech. And now he learned it had all been part of some grand experiment? Michael voiced the question Jake was thinking. "So what happens now? How do you choose between us?" A sly smile played at the corners of Gerald's mouth. "We don't. You two will." The twins exchanged puzzled glances, their shared confusion momentarily overriding their shock and anger. "For the next 3 months," Gerald continued, "you'll be working together on a special project. At the end of that time, you'll present your results to the board, and we'll make our final decision." Jake's analytical mind kicked into gear, already considering the implications of this arrangement. "What's the project?" he asked, leaning forward. Gerald's smile widened. "You're going to save the company." A murmur ran through the room. Jake and Michael both sat up straighter, their competitive instincts piqued despite the bizarre circumstances. "Save the company?" Michael repeated. "From what?" Janet Chun spoke up again. "Sullivan Tech is facing a crisis. Our main competitor, Nexitech, is on the verge of releasing a product that could render our entire line obsolete. We need fresh ideas, innovative solutions, and leadership that can guide us through this challenge." Jake's mind was already spinning with possibilities. He'd been tracking Nexitech's movements for months, suspecting they were up to something big. But before he could voice any of his thoughts, Gerald dropped another bombshell. "You'll be working out of our Chicago office," he said. "Neutral territory. You'll have access to all of Sullivan Tech's resources, but you'll be operating independently from both the New York and Los Angeles divisions." Jake and Michael exchanged another glance, this one filled with a mix of trepidation and grudging curiosity. 3 months working side by side with the brother they never knew existed, competing for the job they'd both dreamed of. It was almost too much to process. "Oh, and one more thing," Gerald added, his tone suddenly serious. This project isn't just about saving the company. It's about family too. By the end of these 3 months, I expect you both to have answers about your past and to have figured out what kind of future you want, not just for Sullivan Tech, but for yourselves as brothers. With that, Gerald stood, signaling the end of the meeting. As the board members filed out, Jake and Michael remained seated, the weight of everything they just learned settling over them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "So," he said, a hint of challenge in his voice, "I guess we're going to Chicago." Jake met his brother's gaze, seeing his own determination reflected back at him. "I guess we are," he replied. As they stood to leave, neither brother noticed the small, satisfied smile on Gerald's face, nor the way his hand shook slightly as he reached into his pocket, fingering an old, worn photograph of 2 identical baby boys. The Chicago office of Sullivan Tech stood as a gleaming sentinel on the shores of Lake Michigan, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the historic buildings surrounding it. As Jake and Michael stepped out of their separate taxis, each couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu, remembering their respective first days at the New York and Los Angeles offices. Jake adjusted his tie, a habit born of nervousness he thought he'd long since overcome. "Ready for this?" he asked, glancing at Michael. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Born ready," he quipped, then winced at his own choice of words. The question of their birth order hung between them, unspoken but ever-present. As they entered the lobby, a petite woman with a shock of bright red hair greeted them with a wide smile. "Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Sullivan," she said, her eyes darting between them. "I'm Evelyn Cho, your project coordinator. Welcome to Chicago." Jake and Michael exchanged a look, both thinking the same thing. This was going to take some getting used to. Evelyn led them to a large corner office on the top floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city and the lake beyond. "This will be your shared workspace for the duration of the project," she explained, gesturing to the twin desks facing each other. "I hope you don't mind the proximity. We thought it might facilitate collaboration." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Collaboration? I thought this was a competition." Evelyn's smile didn't waver. "It's both, gentlemen. Your father, Mr. Sullivan Sr. was quite clear. The success of this project depends on your ability to work together, even as you showcase your individual strengths." Jake moved to one of the desks, running his hand along its smooth surface. "And what exactly is this project? We weren't given many details back in New York." Evelyn's expression turned serious. "Nexitech is developing a quantum computing platform that could revolutionize the tech industry. If they succeed, Sullivan Tech's current product line will become obsolete overnight. Your job is to develop a counter-strategy. Either beat them to the punch with our own quantum computing solution, or pivot the company in a direction that makes Nexitech's advancements irrelevant." Michael whistled low. "No pressure or anything. You have 3 months," Evelyn continued, "at the end of which you'll present your findings and recommendations to the board. They'll use that presentation, along with your process throughout the project, to determine who will be the next CEO of Sullivan Tech." Jake and Michael locked eyes across the room, the weight of the challenge settling over them. For a moment, the air crackled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Evelyn cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "I'll leave you to get settled. You'll find all the necessary files and access codes on your computers. If you need anything, my office is just down the hall." With a final nod, she left, closing the door behind her. The twins stood in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation sinking in. Finally, Michael spoke. "So, how do you want to do this? Divide and conquer, or work together?" Jake considered for a moment. "Let's start by reviewing what we each know about Nexitech and quantum computing. Then we can decide on our approach." Michael nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Sounds like a plan." As they settled into their desks and began to work, neither could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Little did they know, hidden behind a painting on the wall, a small camera recorded their every move, feeding directly to Gerald Sullivan's private office back in New York. 2 weeks into the project, Jake and Michael had fallen into an uneasy rhythm. They worked long hours, often late into the night, poring over market reports, technical specifications, and confidential intel on Nexitech's progress. Despite their initial reservations, they found themselves grudgingly impressed by each other's skills and insights. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across their office, Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "We're missing something," he muttered, more to himself than to Michael. Michael looked up from his computer, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Jake stood, pacing the length of the office. "Nexitech's quantum computing project. It doesn't add up. They're a software company, not hardware. Where did they suddenly get the expertise for such a massive leap in technology?" Michael nodded slowly, realization dawning. "You're right. And where are they getting the funding? Quantum research burns through cash like nothing else." As if on cue, both brothers turned to their shared whiteboard, where they'd mapped out Nexitech's known resources and capabilities. Jake grabbed a marker and circled a name they'd barely paid attention to before. Dr. Elena Rossi, recently hired as Nexitech's head of research and development. "Her," Jake said, tapping the marker against the board. "She's the key. We need to know more about her." Michael was already typing furiously on his keyboard. "I'm on it. Let's see what we can dig up." As they delved deeper into Dr. Rossi's background, a pattern began to emerge. Before joining Nexitech, she had worked for a series of small, seemingly unrelated tech startups. But as Jake and Michael cross-referenced dates and project descriptions, they realized these companies all had one thing in common. They were all working on different aspects of quantum computing technology. "It's like a puzzle," Michael mused, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. Nexitech has been quietly acquiring all these small companies, piecing together the expertise they needed. Jake nodded, impressed despite himself. "Clever. They've managed to fly under the radar while assembling a quantum computing dream team." As the night wore on, fueled by coffee and the excitement of their breakthrough, Jake and Michael lost themselves in the work. They barely noticed as the first rays of dawn began to streak across the sky, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of pink and gold. It was Michael who finally broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "You know," he said, his voice hesitant, "we make a pretty good team." Jake looked up, surprised by the admission. For a moment, he saw not a rival, but a reflection of himself, the same determined set of the jaw, the same fire in the eyes. "Yeah," he agreed softly. "I guess we do." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Evelyn entered, her eyes widening as she took in their disheveled appearance and the chaos of papers and empty coffee cups strewn across the office. "Gentlemen," she said, a note of concern in her voice, "I have some news. Your father, Mr. Sullivan Sr., he's had a heart attack." Jake and Michael froze, the color draining from their faces. In that instant, all thoughts of competition and corporate strategy vanished, replaced by a shared fear for the man who, for better or worse, had brought them into this world. "He's stable," Evelyn continued quickly, seeing their distress. "But he's asking for both of you. There's a company jet waiting at O'Hare to take you back to New York." As Jake and Michael rushed to gather their things, a silent understanding passed between them. The project, the competition, their newfound rivalry. It all paled in comparison to the sudden, stark reality of their shared connection to Gerald Sullivan. As they hurried out of the office, neither noticed the small red light blinking on the hidden camera, still faithfully recording every moment of their unfolding drama. The sleek Sullivan Tech private jet cut through the early morning sky, its passengers sitting in tense silence. Jake stared out the window, watching the patchwork landscape of America unfold beneath them. Across the aisle, Michael absently tapped away at his tablet, more out of habit than any real focus on work. "Did you know?" Jake's voice broke the silence, startling Michael from his thoughts. "Know what?" Jake turned to face his brother, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. "About his heart condition. Did you know Gerald had health issues?" Michael's brow furrowed. "No, I had no idea. Dad, I mean, Gerald, he always seemed so invincible, you know? Jake nodded, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. As the plane began its descent into New York, both brothers found themselves lost in thought, grappling with the complex emotions stirred up by Gerald's health scare. For Jake, it was a stark reminder of the father-son relationship he'd never had. For Michael, it was the frightening realization that the man he'd looked up to all his life wasn't as indestructible as he'd always believed. The hospital corridor was a stark contrast to the polished corporate environments they were used to. The antiseptic smell and harsh fluorescent lighting set both men on edge as they followed a nurse to Gerald's private room. They paused outside the door, exchanging a glance. In that moment, the competition that had defined their relationship thus far seemed to evaporate, replaced by a shared apprehension. "Ready?" Michael asked softly. Jake took a deep breath and nodded. "As I'll ever be." They entered the room to find Gerald propped up in bed, looking smaller and more vulnerable than either had ever seen him. His eyes lit up as he saw them, a weak smile spreading across his pale face. "My boys," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Both of you, together. It's about time." Jake and Michael moved to either side of the bed, the mirrored action so natural it surprised them both. "Dad," Michael started, his voice thick with emotion. "How are you feeling?" Gerald waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I'll be fine. These doctors, they worry too much. But never mind me. How's the project going? Are you two playing nice?" Jake couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of the situation. "You're in a hospital bed, and you're asking about work?" Gerald's eyes twinkled with a hint of their usual sharpness. "Sullivan Tech is my life's work, Jake. It's more than just a company to me. It's my legacy, our legacy." The use of "our" wasn't lost on Jake, and he felt a sudden lump in his throat. "We've made some progress," Michael replied, glancing at Jake. "Actually, we've had a bit of a breakthrough regarding Nexateca's strategy." Gerald nodded approvingly. Good. I knew you two would work well together. You always did, even as babies." The offhand comment hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jake and Michael exchanged a look, years of questions bubbling to the surface. Jake began cautiously. "I think it's time you told us the truth. All of it. Why were we separated? Why didn't I know about Michael? Why didn't he know about me?" Gerald's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sadness and regret. He sighed heavily, seeming to age years in a matter of seconds. "You're right," he said softly. "You both deserve to know everything. But first, there's something you need to see. In my office at Sullivan Tech headquarters, there's a safe behind the painting of the company's first building. The combination is your birthday, both of your birthdays." Michael frowned. "What's in the safe?" Gerald's eyes moved between his sons, a mixture of love and apprehension in his gaze. "A video, security footage from the day you were born. It will answer a lot of your questions, including which of you is the firstborn." Jake felt his heart race at the prospect of finally uncovering the truth. "Why didn't you just tell us? Why all the secrecy?" Gerald reached out, grasping each of their hands in his own. "Because the truth is complicated and dangerous. There are people who would do anything to keep that video from seeing the light of day. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll look out for each other." The urgency in Gerald's voice sent a chill down Jake's spine. He looked at Michael, seeing his own confusion and determination reflected back at him. "We promise," they said in unison. As they left the hospital, the weight of Gerald's words hung heavily between them. Whatever was on that video, whatever truth awaited them in that safe, they knew their lives would never be the same again. The Sullivan Tech headquarters loomed before them, its familiar facade now shrouded in mystery. Jake and Michael stood side by side in the elevator, the tension palpable as they ascended to the top floor. "What do you think we'll find?" Michael asked, breaking the silence. Jake shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever it is," Gerald seemed pretty shaken up about it. As they entered Gerald's office, the painting Gerald had mentioned seemed to stare back at them, guarding its secrets. Michael moved it aside, revealing the sleek, modern safe embedded in the wall. Jake stepped forward, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He glanced at Michael. "Ready?" Michael nodded, his jaw set with determination. Jake input their shared birthday, and with a soft beep, the safe swung open. Inside lay a single USB drive, innocuous in appearance but heavy with the promise of long-buried truths. They moved to Gerald's computer, inserting the drive with shaking hands. A single video file appeared on the screen. Jake double-clicked, and the brothers held their breath as the footage began to play. The grainy security camera footage showed a hospital corridor, date-stamped 35 years ago. A younger Gerald paced nervously outside a room, occasionally glancing at his watch. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from within the room. Medical staff rushed in and out, their faces tense. Then, amid the chaos, a nurse emerged, cradling two tiny bundles. She approached Gerald, her expression grave. The audio was muffled, but her words came through clearly enough. "Mr. Sullivan, congratulations. You have two healthy baby boys. But there's been a complication with your wife." Gerald's face crumpled, and he sank to his knees. The nurse tried to hand him the babies, but he waved her away, lost in his grief. As Jake and Michael watched, transfixed, a new figure entered the frame. A man in a sharp suit approached Gerald, placing a hand on his shoulder. The camera angle shifted, giving a clear view of the man's face. Michael gasped. "That's Robert Nexus, the founder of Nexitech." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "What's he doing there?" On screen, Robert helped Gerald to his feet, speaking urgently. Gerald nodded, his expression shifting from grief to determination. He took one of the babies from the nurse, handing it to Robert. Then, cradling the other child, he hurried down the corridor, Robert close behind with the second infant. The video cut to a different camera showing the hospital parking lot. Gerald and Robert emerged, each carrying a baby. They split up, heading to separate cars. As they drove away in opposite directions, the footage ended. Jake and Michael sat in stunned silence, the implications of what they just witnessed slowly sinking in. "He gave one of us away," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "To Robert Nexus. But why?" Michael shook his head, equally bewildered. "And which one of us? Who's the real Sullivan?" Before either could say more, a noise from the outer office caught their attention. Footsteps approached, accompanied by hushed voices. Jake quickly ejected the USB drive, slipping it into his pocket. He and Michael moved away from the computer just as the office door burst open. Two men in dark suits entered, their expressions grim. Behind them stood a familiar face, Janet Chun, the board member who had been present at their initial meeting. "Gentlemen," Janet said, her voice cold, "I'm afraid you've seen something you weren't supposed to. We need to talk." As the men in suits moved to block the exits, Jake and Michael exchanged a look. Whatever truth they had uncovered, it was clear that powerful forces wanted it to remain hidden. The real challenge, they realized, was only just beginning. The tension in Gerald's office was palpable as Jake and Michael faced Janet Chun and her intimidating escorts. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his pocket, feeling the weight of the USB drive containing the shocking footage they'd just witnessed. "Ms. Chun," Michael said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were just dash." Janet cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Save it, Mr. Sullivan. Or should I say, Mr. Nexus? We know exactly what you've seen." Jake's mind raced, trying to process the implications of Janet's words. "So you know about the video? About Robert Nexus?" Janet's expression remained impassive. "We know everything, Jake. We've always known. The question is, what are you going to do with this information?" Michael stepped forward, his posture defensive. "That depends. Are you going to tell us the truth? All of it?" For a moment, Janet seemed to consider their request. Then, with a sigh, she nodded to her guards. "Stand down, gentlemen. I think it's time we had an honest conversation." As the guards relaxed their stance, Janet moved to Gerald's desk, perching on its edge. "What you saw in that video is only part of the story. 35 years ago, Sullivan Tech and Nexitech weren't rivals. They were partners, working on a top-secret government project. Jake and Michael exchanged glances, their shared shock evident. Janet continued, "Your mother, Elizabeth, was a brilliant quantum physicist. She made a breakthrough that would have revolutionized computing as we know it. But there were complications." "What kind of complications?" Jake pressed. Janet's eyes darkened. "The kind that get people killed." Elizabeth realized the potential dangers of her discovery if it fell into the wrong hands. She wanted to destroy her research, but Gerald and Robert disagreed. The night you were born, Elizabeth had planned to go public with her concerns. Michael's face paled as he connected the dots. The complication the nurse mentioned in the video, it wasn't just about the birth, was it? Janet shook her head solemnly. No. Elizabeth died that night under suspicious circumstances. Gerald and Robert, fearing for your safety, made a decision. They would each take one of you, raise you separately, and keep the truth hidden until the time was right. Jake felt a surge of anger. And when exactly was the right time supposed to be? After we'd spent our entire lives in the dark. Gerald always planned to tell you, Janet explained. But as you grew older, as the rivalry between Sullivan Tech and Nexitech intensified, it became more complicated. He hoped that by bringing you together for this project, you'd discover the truth on your own, and perhaps find a way to reunite the companies and finish what your mother started. Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. So this whole competition, the CEO position, it was all just a ruse? Janet stood, her expression softening slightly. Not entirely. Gerald truly wanted to see which of you would be best suited to lead Sullivan Tech into the future. But more than that, he wanted to see if you could work together, the way he and Robert once did. Jake's analytical mind kicked into gear, processing this new information. Wait, if Michael is actually a Nexus, then why didn't Robert ever tell him the truth? A sad smile played at Janet's lips. Because, Jake, Michael is a Sullivan. You're the one Robert raised. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His entire identity, everything he thought he knew about himself, shattered in an instant. Michael reached out, steadying his brother as Jake swayed on his feet. It's too much. What are we supposed to do with all this? Janet's expression turned grave. That's the question, isn't it? Because now that you know the truth, you're both in danger. There are people, powerful people, who want your mother's research. People who believe it's hidden somewhere within Sullivan Tech or Nexitech. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. As if on cue, the sound of breaking glass shattered the tense atmosphere. Smoke began to fill the office as a canister rolled across the floor. Get down! Janet yelled, diving for cover. Jake and Michael dropped to the floor as chaos erupted around them. Through the thickening smoke, they could make out shadowy figures rappelling through the broken window. As alarms blared and shouts echoed from the hallway, Jake felt Michael's hand grasp his arm. Whatever happens, Michael shouted over the din. We're in this together now, brother. Jake nodded, a surge of determination cutting through his confusion and fear. Whatever the truth of their past, whatever dangers lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't facing it alone anymore. As the smoke swirled around them and unknown assailants closed in, Jake and Michael Sullivan, reunited twins and reluctant heirs to a dangerous legacy, prepared to fight for their lives and for the truth that had been hidden from them for so long. The chaos in Gerald's office was total. Smoke billowed, alarms blared, and the sounds of struggle filled the air. Jake and Michael, operating on pure instinct, moved in perfect sync. They'd spent weeks competing against each other, but now, faced with a common threat, their coordination was flawless. The USB, Jake shouted over the din, reaching for his pocket. To his horror, he found it empty. The drive must have fallen out in the confusion. Michael caught his brother's panicked look and nodded in understanding. They dropped to the floor, feeling blindly through the smoke for the precious piece of technology that held the key to their past. Janet's voice cut through the chaos. This way, she called. gesturing toward a hidden panel in the wall that had slid open. Emergency exit. Jake's hand closed around the USB drive just as a dark figure loomed over him. Without hesitation, Michael tackled the assailant, giving Jake the opening he needed to scramble to his feet. The brothers rushed toward Janet and the secret passage, dodging grasping hands and flying debris. As they tumbled into the narrow corridor beyond, Janet slammed her hand on a button, sealing the entrance behind them. They ran through the twisting passageway, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. Finally, they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, finding themselves in an alley behind the Sullivan Tech building. "Quick, this way," Janet urged, leading them to a nondescript sedan parked nearby. As they peeled away from the curb, Jake looked back to see smoke billowing from the upper floors of the Sullivan Tech headquarters. "Where are we going?" Michael asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Janet's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere we can figure out our next move." As the city blurred past them, Jake turned the USB drive over in his hands, marveling at how such a small object could contain so much power and danger. "So," he said, breaking the tense silence, "I guess we're not going back to Chicago to finish that project." Michael let out a strangled laugh. "I think we've got a new project now, brother." The word brother hung in the air between them, full of newfound meaning. Despite the danger, despite the earth-shattering revelations of the day, both Jake and Michael felt a sense of completeness they'd never known before. As Janet navigated through the city traffic, her expression grim, Jake's mind raced with questions. What exactly had their mother discovered? Why were people willing to kill for it? And most importantly, how were they going to unravel this mystery without ending up like their mother? The sedan pulled into an underground parking garage, and Janet ushered them into a service elevator. As they ascended, she finally spoke. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice low and urgent. "What I'm about to tell you goes beyond corporate rivalry or family secrets. Your mother's research, it wasn't just about quantum computing. It was about changing the very fabric of reality itself." The elevator doors opened, revealing a high-tech safe house that looked like something out of a spy movie. As they stepped inside, Jake and Michael exchanged a look. They'd started this journey as rivals, became reluctant partners, and now found themselves brothers united against a threat they barely understood. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers they would face, one thing was certain: the Sullivan twins were in this together, ready to uncover the truth about their past and fight for their future. Janet moved to a sophisticated computer terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Gentlemen, welcome to Operation Quantum Legacy. It's time you learned the full story of Elizabeth Sullivan's work and why the world isn't ready for it." As the screen before them flickered to life, displaying complex equations and diagrams, Jake and Michael steeled themselves for what was to come. The competition for CEO seemed a lifetime ago. Now, they were embarking on a mission that would challenge everything they thought they knew about science, family, and the very nature of reality itself. The journey that had begun with a simple corporate rivalry had transformed into something far greater: a quest for truth, a fight for survival, and a chance to finish the work their mother had started all those years ago. As Janet began to explain the intricacies of their mother's groundbreaking research, Jake and Michael listened intently, their minds racing with the possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever challenges they would face them together, as brothers, as Sullivans. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.